Some growers learned last season how wheat stem maggot could impact corn. As we told you in June, the damage from wheat stem maggot was limited to very specific instances. They featured corn, which was planted into a green rye or wheat cover crop. Nebraska Extension's Justin McMechan says wheat stem maggot isn't the only pest that can infiltrate a cover crop. He joined us recently to explain why farmers could benefit from scouting fields for other insects.
Yeah, there are a lot of different pests that can come into a cover crop system, and there are beneficials with that system, so it's kind of complex between the two. But we have black cutworm and true armyworm and common stalk borer, and we want to be concerned about these because they're easy to manage if we know they're coming into the system. And then there's some management techniques that growers can use to avoid significant loss to their cash crop that follows.
Tell me more about which insects could be in there.
Yeah, so black cutworm migrates from the south each year. It kind of hits the edge of our state. We monitor for it coming into the state, and that's important for growers, and Crop Watch and Market Journal and other places are good places to find out the biofix, which is when they occur in large numbers. And we can use that to estimate when we might see damage. So if they've got a cover crop in their system, those black cutworms might come in and lay eggs in that cover crop. And then we can tell them roughly 300 growing degree days later that they'll start feeding possibly on their cash crop. We have common stalk borer, which is native to the area, it's been around for a long time. It also has degree days associated with it. And so there's a series of insects like that that all have some estimation when they're going to cause damage. And so it's relatively easy at least to scout, and depending on what BT traits they're using or insecticides that they might be applying in furrow or as a seed treatment, they may be able to manage some of those.
Describe the newness of this, sort of the unfamiliarity of trying to find these in cover crops.
Yeah, well, we have some literature, obviously, and some recent literature from other states, but we're seeing differences between states and locations, as well as the management practices associated with the cover crops there. And so we really are not as familiar in making estimations based on pest biology here on what the pest potential is. So we want to be a little bit cautious. We obviously get some new pests that show up in the system as well. But this is something we have some ongoing research here to get a better estimation within the state. It's complicated because there's multiple crop species as well, cover crop species.
Last year, one of the new insects that we learned about was wheat stem maggot in cover crop.
Yeah.
Recap for me the problems that we saw.
Sure, never been found on a widespread scale like that. We'd had isolated incidents in the past, 2015 and 2012, down in Kansas, an isolated site. But this past spring was pretty different for us in terms of cover crops, and we had issues with termination. And so a lot of growers were terminating just a few days prior or at planting, which is uncharacteristic to the zones for termination for this part of the state, where we typically terminate 15 days in advance or 5 days in advance. And these wheat stem maggots, which we really never see in cornfields, were what we think was feeding on the cover crop. It got terminated, and then they had to complete their development, and so they moved to the nearest thing, which was the corn. And we saw some pretty significant losses across the state. I think we got as high as 55% on an infestation in a cornfield and 30 bushel yield losses, which actually growers were surprisingly happy about, considering how bad things looked in the spring with the plants showing the type of symptoms they did.
Did you learn anything from that would be applicable for this season?
Yeah, we're still learning a lot. We've got a colony, we're testing, we're determining what development stage of corn they could cause damage on. So if there's any, off sync between those two, that would help. But we would suggest, at least I would suggest to any grower that's concerned about it, to terminate at least 14 days in advance of planting their corn crop. Make sure it's good and dead. We're not sure how long they can survive without a cover crop, so that's another question we have. But assuming and based on their physiology, they probably can't survive too long. So termination's a big one, terminate early.
How big is termination for those other insects and method of termination?
It is big. We have seed corn maggot that show up. They're always in the state every year. And the termination method and timing is really important for that insect. And so if you terminate with tillage and you have this decomposing material, they'll move in and infest that material. And then if you plant your cash crop, corn or soybeans, into that system, they can cause damage in that system. So that's an important one to look out for. It has degree days too, so it's another one that we can predict its adult movement.
When we say cover crops, is that a catch-all?
It is and it isn't. What I'm really referencing is wheat and rye cover crops. There are lots of others that producers are using in the state. We have even less information on those in terms of pest or beneficial potential in those. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of research to be done.
Yes, Justin, let's end on a positive note. Tell me about the beneficial insects.
Yeah, there are a lot of beneficial insects in this system, and in coming across producers discussing pests, they say, why don't I just spray? And we really want to avoid that. We want to use IPM practices when we decide whether or not we want to spray for a pest. There are carabid beetles, little ground beetles in this system. They feed on weed seeds. We have weed issues obviously in the state. They also feed on other insects that are pest problems. And we have some papers from other states that show that they can actually knock down important pests like western corn rootworm, where they're using slender wheatgrass. We don't know what that's like in our state. And in terms of aphids, we've had lady beetles that have knocked down aphid populations. Koch has a published paper from 2016 and 2012 up in Minnesota. So we want to be cautious and try and keep those in the system so they have a carryover positive effect on our cash crop.